In a bustling market filled with whispers and suspicion, street performer May is wrongly accused of theft, her once bright world crumbling into isolation. Determined to clear her name, she uncovers a web of lies, betrayal, and a shadowy orchestrator exploiting her as a scapegoat. With only her wits, her juggling skills, and the help of a street-smart boy named Jian, May must outsmart the real criminals before they destroy her for good. What price will May pay to uncover the truth? The marketplace was alive, an intricate symphony of voices, clattering wares, and the occasional squawk of a restless chicken. Bright paper lanterns swayed above the cobblestone square, glowing faintly in the midday sun. May's practiced hands moved in a blur as she juggled brightly colored balls, drawing a semicircle of curious onlookers. Her costume, a patchwork of crimson and gold with tiny bells stitched along the hem, jingled softly with her every motion. A few children giggled, mimicking her movements. Their joy was a small but steady light in her often shadowed life. May's eyes sparkled, but not with the innocence her audience assumed. Each toss of a ball was carefully measured, her focus sharp. She was aware of the eyes in the crowd, some curious, others dismissive. But one pair of eyes lingered, darker and more intent than the rest. Standing just beyond the crowd, a shadowy figure leaned against a stall, seemingly uninterested yet unwavering in their watch. Her performance ended with a flourishing bow, and a smattering of applause greeted her efforts. May swept her small hat along the ground, collecting the occasional clink of coins. As the crowd dispersed, she saw the merchant at the fruit stand nearby whispering to another vendor, pointing subtly in her direction. She froze. The merchant's face, lined with worry and a tinge of suspicion, twisted further as he bellowed over the crowd, "Thief! That's the one! She took my cash box!" A collective gasp rippled through the market, the noise flattening to a disbelieving murmur. May's mouth opened, but no words came. A rush of hot shame bloomed in her chest as the accusation struck her. She shook her head, lifting her hands in protest. "I didn't take anything! I was juggling right here!" The merchant's heavy steps pounded toward her, his accusing finger now trembling with fury. "You were right there! Don't lie to me, girl! Hand it over!" The crowd encircled them, and the same children who had been laughing moments ago clung to their parents, eyes wide. May glanced around desperately, her mind racing. "Search me!" she cried, her voice cracking. "I don't have anything!" An elderly woman in the crowd coughed. "She's always here, performing. Doesn't seem the type to steal." But her defense barely dented the wall of suspicion closing in. May's costume, bright and distinctive, painted her as an easy scapegoat. Soon, other vendors joined in, their words stinging as they voiced their own grievances about missing goods or dwindling cash. None tied directly to May, but all convenient ammunition now. The market guard arrived, his leather boots scuffing against the cobblestones. He towered over May, his tone low but firm. "We'll search her. If she's innocent, she'll have nothing to fear." Her body stiffened as their hands searched her pockets, her bag, even her juggling props. Of course, they found nothing, but the damage was done. "Doesn't mean she didn't stash it somewhere," the merchant grumbled, his arms crossed. "She's clever, this one." The crowd began to dissipate, though not without casting lingering glances her way. May tried to steady her trembling hands, but the guard's warning stayed with her. "Keep your nose clean, girl. Folks around here don't take kindly to thieves." The market that had once been her lifeblood now felt suffocating. As the shadows stretched long across the square, May packed her belongings, her face a blank mask. She caught sight of the dark figure from earlier, still watching her from the shadows, then slipping silently into the alleyway. For the first time that day, May felt true fear. May avoided the market for weeks after the incident. Word had spread quickly, and vendors began to shoo her away when she tried to perform. She set up her act in quieter corners of the city, but the crowds were smaller, the coins fewer. Hunger gnawed at her belly, and the chill of early autumn seeped into her thin costume. But even in her exile, May couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. A glimpse of a shadow in her periphery, the crunch of hurried footsteps when hers slowed, Always, she felt those same dark eyes upon her. And then there were the patterns. Vendors whispering in hushed tones about more thefts. She overheard fragments of conversations. Someone slipping through the crowd and never caught them in the act. The accusations against her seemed to have sparked a surge in crimes, and she realized with a sinking heart that her tarnished reputation had made her the perfect distraction for a more cunning thief. Yet no one else seemed to notice. Her days became a blur of fleeting performances and sleepless nights, her mind replaying the events of that terrible day in the market. The only certainty she clung to was that she had to find the real thief and prove her innocence, not just to the merchants, but to herself. Her heart burned with quiet determination, a fragile but stubborn flame. Late one night, as she sat near the city fountain, juggling stones to calm her restless thoughts, she heard a faint jingle, a sound that didn't belong to her rhythm. She stopped, the stones tumbling to the ground, and peered into the darkness. A figure darted between two lampposts, swift and silent. May rose to her feet, her pulse quickening. Whoever they were, they had made one mistake, underestimating her. The city sprawled like a labyrinth, its narrow alleys and weathered stone walls filled with stories May could only guess at. Every corner seemed to whisper secrets, and every shadow carried the weight of unseen eyes. May hugged her patched bag closer as she wandered through a quieter part of the city. The sky above was a muted gray, casting the buildings in a dull, ashen light. The figure she had glimpsed by the fountain the night before haunted her thoughts. Its movement had been deliberate, the jingle too similar to the sound of her costume's bells to dismiss as coincidence. The market thefts, the growing suspicion against her, and the stranger's presence all connected in ways she couldn't yet decipher. May stopped by a bakery where the sweet smell of fresh bread filled the air. She hesitated before stepping in, her fingers brushing the few coins in her pocket. The baker's wife, a stern woman with sharp eyes, stared at her with thinly veiled mistrust. "What do you want?" the woman asked, her voice cold. May swallowed her pride. "Just one roll, please," she murmured, sliding her coins onto the counter. The baker's wife took the money without a word and handed her a small, slightly burnt roll. May accepted it with a forced smile and left quickly, the door's bell tinkling behind her. Outside, she sat on a low wall and broke the bread into small pieces, savoring each bite despite its dryness. She had learned to stretch what little she had, each crumb a small act of defiance against her circumstances. As she ate, she scanned the street. Her instincts, honed from years of performing in crowded spaces, told her she wasn't alone. Her eyes darted to a figure lingering at the edge of her vision, pretending to examine a stack of crates. It was the same shadowy presence from the night before. The realization sent a chill down her spine. May decided to test her theory. Rising to her feet, she walked briskly down the street, weaving through alleyways and doubling back at random intervals. The figure followed, always at a distance, but never close enough to make out their features. The chase ended when May rounded a corner and pressed herself into a recessed doorway, waiting with bated breath. Moments later, the figure appeared, pausing in confusion as they searched for her. May sprang from her hiding place, her voice sharp. "Why are you following me?" The figure flinched but didn't flee. Instead, they stepped closer, their features coming into view. A boy, no older than 15, with shaggy hair and a wiry frame. His clothes were tattered, and his dark eyes darted nervously, like a cornered animal. I wasn't following you," he stammered, though his trembling hands betrayed him. May folded her arms, her expression stern. "Don't lie. I've seen you watching me. What do you want?" The boy hesitated, then pulled a small object from his pocket, a tarnished coin. "I was just making sure you were okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. May frowned, her suspicion giving way to confusion. "Why would you care about that?" The boy's gaze dropped to the ground. "Because I know what it's like, to be blamed for things you didn't do." Over the next few days, May found herself crossing paths with the boy again and again. His name was Jian, and he lived on the streets, surviving on scraps and odd jobs. He was guarded at first, reluctant to share much about himself, but his sharp wit and quick hands hinted at a resourcefulness born from necessity. Despite her initial wariness, May felt a reluctant kinship with him. Like her, he was an outsider, navigating a world that seemed determined to push him to the margin. Their conversations were brief, often interrupted by the demands of survival, but they carried a quiet understanding that words couldn't fully capture. One evening, as they sat by the riverbank, May finally asked the question that had been weighing on her. "Why were you really following me?" Jian hesitated, his fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. "I saw what happened at the market," he admitted. "I saw how they treated you." May's breath caught. "Did you see who took the cash box?" Jian shook his head, his expression pained. "No, but I've seen someone else watching you. Someone who doesn't belong in the market." Her heart sank. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" "I didn't think you'd believe me," he said, his voice defensive. "No one believes people like us." May stared at him, a mix of frustration and sympathy swirling within her. He was right. Trust was a fragile thing, and the world they lived in had taught them to guard it fiercely. But if Jian's instincts were correct, then the real thief was still out there, using her as a shield. "We need to find them," May said, her voice firm, "before they do it again." Jian looked at her, his eyes filled with equal parts fear and determination. "How?" May smiled faintly, a flicker of her old confidence returning. "I'm a performer. People underestimate what I can do, and you're quick and clever. Together we can outsmart them." For the first time in weeks, May felt a glimmer of hope. The path ahead was uncertain, but she was no longer walking it alone. The market looked different when viewed with a purpose. The usual chaos of haggling voices, clattering carts, and vibrant stalls now seemed like pieces on a chessboard, each movement hinting at a larger strategy. May and Jian stood at the edge of the bustling square, the former adjusting her scarf to obscure her costume's bells, the latter fiddling nervously with his sleeves. "You remember the plan?" May asked, her tone low but firm. Jian nodded. "I find a high spot and watch. If I see anyone suspicious, I signal you. And I'll draw their attention if they try to move," May added, gripping her juggling props tightly. She glanced at the crowd, her chest tightening. "Be careful, Jian. Don't get too close. I know how to stay invisible," he said with a sly smile, already darting into the maze of stalls. May watched him disappear, her heart heavy with a mixture of worry and determination. Jian's street smarts were undeniable, but he was still a boy, a fragile thread in a world quick to snap at weakness. She turned her attention back to the market, her mind honing in on the task at hand. She had chosen a spot near a fountain, its constant trickle masking the faint jingle of her bells. From here, she could see most of the market's central lanes. Her hands moved automatically, tossing 3 brightly colored balls into the air, their rhythm a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. The act was as much for her as it was for the growing audience, who began to slow their steps and gather in loose clusters. Her performance, however, wasn't her focus. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for patterns, the lingering glance, the hesitant step, the unnatural stillness. She had learned to read people this way, a skill sharpened by years of working in public spaces where one misstep could cost her a meal. Then she saw it. A man in a plain, nondescript tunic stood near a fruit stall, his hands deftly brushing past the vendor's display as he feigned interest in the produce. He moved with a confidence that belied his ordinary appearance, his head tilting slightly toward the commotion May was causing. Jian's shadow appeared briefly on a rooftop, his arm lifting in a subtle wave. He had seen it too. May's pulse quickened. She finished her act with a dramatic flourish, sending the balls spinning high before catching them all in one sweep. The audience clapped, some tossing coins into her hat, but May barely noticed. Her focus was locked on the man, who was now drifting toward another stall, his movements smooth and deliberate. She grabbed her bag and began weaving through the crowd, her pace steady but unhurried. The man didn't notice her at first, too engrossed in his work. But as she closed the distance, his head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Lost something?" May asked, her voice light but laced with steel. The man froze, his hand hovering near the edge of a merchant's cart. "Excuse me?" May smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. You've been following me around the market. I thought you might need help finding something." The tension in the air crackled as the man's eyes darted to the nearest exit. May shifted subtly, blocking his path. The crowd around them moved obliviously, their chatter and laughter a stark contrast to the charged silence between them. "I don't know what you're talking about," the man said, his voice calm but his fingers twitching. He tried to step around her, but May mirrored his movement. "Don't lie to me," she said, her tone sharpening. "You've been stealing from these vendors, haven't you? And you let me take the blame." The man's mask of indifference cracked for a moment, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "You've got no proof," he said, his voice a low growl, "and no one here will believe you." May's heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain steady. "Maybe not, but I'm not letting you slip away." Before the man could respond, Jian appeared at the edge of the crowd, his face pale but determined. He signaled to May, pointing discreetly to a small pouch dangling from the man's belt, the thief's stash. May didn't hesitate. She reached into her bag and pulled out her juggling knives, blunted for performances but intimidating nonetheless. Tossing one into the air, she caught it with practiced ease, her movements fluid and deliberate. "Let's make this easy," she said, her voice carrying over the hum of the market. "Empty your pockets and leave." The man's composure crumbled as his gaze darted to the knives, then to the growing number of onlookers turning their attention to the confrontation. He muttered a curse under his breath and shoved past May, breaking into a sprint. Jian was already moving. He dropped from the rooftop, landing with surprising agility, and darted after the man. May followed, her bells jingling faintly as she ran. The chase cut through the heart of the market, overturning carts and scattering pedestrians. It ended in a dead-end alley, the man cornered and panting. Jian blocked the only exit, his chest heaving but his eyes fierce. May approached slowly, her knives still in hand. "Last chance," she said, her voice cold. "Drop it." The man hesitated, then threw the pouch to the ground with a snarl. "Fine, take it, but don't think this changes anything." May ignored his words, picking up the pouch and tossing it to Jian. "Go give this back to the vendors," she said. "Make sure they know where it came from." Jian nodded and disappeared, leaving May and the thief alone. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If I ever see you here again, you'll wish I hadn't." The man glared at her but didn't argue. He pushed past her and fled, his footsteps echoing in the narrow alleyway. May stood there for a moment, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like she had a fighting chance. The market was eerily subdued the next morning, as if the tension of the previous day's chase still lingered in the air. May sat on the edge of the fountain, absently tossing a single ball from hand to hand. Jian leaned against a nearby lamppost, watching her with his usual wary curiosity. "I returned the pouch," Jian said, breaking the silence. "They didn't exactly thank me, but at least they didn't call the guards." May nodded, her focus on the rhythmic movement of the ball. "It's a start." Jian crossed his arms, his brows furrowing. "Do you really think he's the only one? That thief?" May paused, catching the ball midair. "No," she admitted, her voice tinged with frustration. "But we can't prove anything yet. Not until we know who's behind this." The boy sighed, kicking at a loose cobblestone. "They'll keep blaming you, you know, even after yesterday." "I know." May's jaw tightened. She had expected as much. The thefts might have a new face now, but the stain on her reputation was far from erased. As they talked, a vendor nearby shouted angrily, waving his arms at a customer. May turned to see a young woman clutching a loaf of bread, her face pale and frightened. The vendor's booming voice echoed through the square. "Trying to steal from me, are you? I'll have the guards on you." "I wasn't," the woman protested, her voice trembling. "I was just holding it. I didn't take anything." May's chest tightened. The scene was painfully familiar. She stood, walking toward the commotion despite Jian's whispered warning to stay back. "Excuse me," May interjected, stepping between the vendor and the woman. Her voice was steady, though her heart raced. Maybe she made a mistake. "Let's not jump to conclusions." The vendor glared at her, his face red with anger. "And who are you to defend her? Everyone knows about you." The words stung, but May refused to let it show. She gestured to the bread. "If she can't pay for it, I'll cover the cost." The vendor hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "Fine, but you'd better watch yourself. You've caused enough trouble here." May handed over a coin, then turned to the young woman. "Go," she said quietly, quickly. The woman hesitated, her eyes glistening with tears, before nodding and disappearing into the crowd. May watched her go, a familiar ache settling in her chest. How many times had she stood in that woman's place, powerless against a world quick to condemn? "You didn't have to do that," Jian said when she returned to the fountain. His tone was equal parts admiration and frustration. "Yes, I did," May replied, her voice soft but firm, "because no one else would." As the days passed, May and Jian worked in unison, their unlikely partnership growing stronger with each passing challenge. They shadowed the market's corners and alleys, observing the ebb and flow of the crowd. Patterns began to emerge. Certain stalls were targeted more often, and specific times saw a spike in activity. The puzzle pieces were slowly falling into place, but one critical piece remained missing: the orchestrator. Late one evening, May sat on the roof of an abandoned warehouse overlooking the market. Jian sat beside her, munching on a half-eaten apple he'd managed to scavenge. The city was quiet now, its energy dissipated with the setting sun. May's gaze lingered on the darkened stalls below, her thoughts restless. "There's someone higher up," she said, breaking the silence. "The thief we caught, he was too sloppy. Whoever's behind this has been doing it for years." Jian nodded, his face thoughtful. "But how do we find them? They're not going to show their face." May's lips curved into a faint smile. "They don't have to. People like that, they're greedy. Sooner or later they'll make a mistake." Their break came 2 nights later. May was performing at a quieter corner of the market, her routine drawing a modest crowd. Jian was stationed nearby, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. As May tossed her props into the air, her hands moved with practiced precision, her mind focused on the task of luring out the thief. Then she saw him. The man was older, with a graying beard and a worn cloak that blended into the market's dull palette. He moved with an air of authority, his steps deliberate. He wasn't watching the vendors or the performers. He was watching the crowd, his gaze flicking from face to face with a calculating sharpness. May felt a surge of certainty. This was the one they'd been searching for. She signaled to Jian, a subtle movement of her hand. The boy slipped through the crowd, his movements almost invisible. May continued her act, her heart pounding as she tracked the man's movements. He stopped near a jewelry stall, his hand brushing against a display case as he spoke quietly to the vendor. Jian returned, his voice barely audible over the hum of the market. "He's giving orders. There's a group of them." May nodded, her mind racing. They couldn't confront him. Not yet, but they could follow him. "Stay close," she whispered, "and stay out of sight." The man left the market shortly after, his cloak billowing slightly as he stepped into a narrow alley. May and Jian trailed him, their footsteps silent against the cobblestones. The alley twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the city's underbelly. They stopped outside a dimly lit warehouse, its entrance guarded by 2 burly men. May pulled Jian into the shadows, her breath catching. This was it, the heart of the operation. "We need proof," May whispered, her eyes fixed on the warehouse. "And we need a plan." Jian's eyes widened. "You're not thinking of going in there, are you?" May's smile was grim. "Not tonight, but soon." The night May decided to act, the air was thick with tension, the kind that seemed to hum just beneath the city's surface. She and Jian stood in the shadow of a crumbling brick wall, the dim glow of the warehouse's lanterns casting long, flickering beams across the alley. May adjusted her scarf, tucking her bells into the folds to silence them. Jian fidgeted with the small slingshot he carried, his face pale but resolute. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. May nodded, her gaze fixed on the warehouse. "We need to end this. If we wait too long, they'll disappear, and we'll lose our chance." Jian swallowed hard but didn't argue. Over the past weeks, their partnership had deepened into a bond forged by necessity and shared purpose. He trusted her, even when her plan seemed impossibly risky. The guards outside the warehouse were still in place, their silhouettes visible against the light spilling through the half-open door. May had spent days observing their patterns, noting the moments when their vigilance waned. Tonight, the market was quieter than usual, and the guards seemed more relaxed, their postures slouched. May whispered to Jian, "I'll distract them. You slip inside and find something we can use, records, stolen goods, anything that ties them to the thefts." Jian hesitated. "What if they catch me?" "They won't," May said firmly. "You're faster than any of them. Just remember the exits." He nodded, gripping his slingshot tightly. May stepped out of the shadows, her heart pounding as she approached the guards. They noticed her immediately, their hands moving to the hilts of their weapons. "Lost, are you?" one of them sneered, his tone mocking. May feigned nervousness, her hands clutching her scarf. I was looking for work," she stammered. "I heard you might need someone to, help out?" The guards exchanged amused glances. "We don't take in strays," the second guard said, his eyes narrowing. "Move along." May hesitated, shifting her weight as if uncertain. Behind her, Jian slipped into the shadows, darting toward the open door. The guards didn't notice, their attention fixed on May. "Please," she said, adding a tremble to her voice. "I'll do anything." The first guard stepped closer, his expression hardening. "I said—" A loud crash from inside the warehouse interrupted him. Both guards turned, their hands drawing their weapons as they rushed toward the source of the noise. May's heart leapt. Jian had done his part. She slipped into the warehouse behind them, the dimly lit interior revealing a chaotic array of crates and barrels. Shadows danced across the walls, the flickering lanterns creating an eerie, shifting light. May crouched behind a stack of crates, her eyes scanning the room for Jian. She spotted him near the back, crouched over a ledger. He looked up and gestured urgently, holding up the book. May nodded, but before she could move toward him, a sharp voice cut through the air. "What's going on here?" The man from the market, the one May had identified as the orchestrator, stood in the center of the room, his presence commanding. The guards flanked him, their weapons drawn as they scanned the room. May ducked lower, her breath shallow. "Search the place," the man barked. "Whoever's here, find them." Jian's eyes widened as the guards began moving through the room. May signaled to him, pointing toward the nearest exit. He hesitated, then nodded, clutching the ledger tightly as he darted toward the shadows. One of the guards spotted him. "Hey, stop!" Jian ran, his small frame slipping between crates as the guards gave chase. May acted on instinct. She grabbed a nearby rope attached to a stack of barrels and yanked it hard. The barrels toppled with a deafening crash, blocking the guard's path and buying Jian precious seconds. The man's gaze snapped to May, his eyes narrowing. "You again," he said, his voice low and dangerous. May stepped out of the shadows, her chin lifted defiantly. "It's over. We know what you've been doing." The man laughed, the sound cold and mirthless. "You think anyone will believe you? You're a nobody, a street rat." "Maybe," May said, her voice steady. "But I'm not alone." Jian appeared at the exit, the ledger clutched tightly to his chest. He raised it high, his voice clear despite the tremor in his hands. "This has everything. Names, dates, all of it. The guards will believe this." The man's smirk faltered, his eyes darting toward the guards who had stopped in their tracks. "Get him!" he shouted. May moved quickly, tossing her juggling knives into the air in a dazzling display. The guards hesitated, their attention drawn to the flashing blades. Jian took the opportunity to slip out of the warehouse, disappearing into the night. The man lunged toward May, his hand reaching for her arm. She twisted away, her movements fluid and precise. "You've already lost," she said, her voice firm. "The truth is out." The man's face darkened with fury, but before he could respond, the distant sound of a whistle pierced the air. The city guards were coming. May stepped back, her heart pounding as the man and his lackeys scrambled to flee. She didn't pursue them. Her job was done. Instead, she slipped out of the warehouse, her feet carrying her swiftly to the safety of the night. Outside, Jian waited, his face lit with a mix of triumph and relief. "We did it," he said, holding up the ledger. May smiled, her breath coming in short bursts. It's not over yet, but they won't be able to hide now. The first streaks of dawn painted the sky as May and Jian slipped into the city's quieter streets, the stolen ledger tucked securely under Jian's arm. The air was heavy with exhaustion, but their victory had invigorated them. May's thoughts churned with the possibilities. The market vendor's stolen goods, the orchestrator's web of deceit, and most importantly, her chance to clear her name. They ducked into a narrow alley behind a small bakery, its warm scent wafting through the cracks of the door. Jian slumped against the wall, his chest heaving. May crouched beside him, her eyes scanning the ledger's pages. The names, dates, and details were meticulous, far more organized than she'd expected. It was damning evidence. "This will prove everything," Jian said between breaths, his voice tinged with hope. May nodded, though a thread of doubt lingered. "It's enough to get the city guards to act, but we need to be smart about how we use it. If they find out we have this before we hand it over, they'll try to silence us." Jian's eyes widened. "You mean, kill us?" May didn't answer directly. Instead, she focused on the task ahead. "We'll go to Captain Wei," she said, referring to the head of the city guards. "He's fair. If anyone will listen, it's him." They rested briefly, sharing a dry piece of bread before venturing out again. The streets were waking, merchants setting up their stalls and workers bustling to their trade. May kept her scarf high, her bells muffled, while Jian clung to her side, his small frame almost hidden in her shadow. As they approached the guardhouse, a familiar unease settled over May. The guards stood at the entrance, their expressions stern. May's heart hammered as she stepped forward, the ledger hidden beneath her cloak. "I need to speak to Captain Wei," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. One of the guards frowned. "And who are you to demand that?" "It's about the market thefts," May said, meeting his gaze. "I have proof." The guards exchanged glances, then reluctantly stepped aside. They escorted May and Jian inside, the imposing stone walls of the guardhouse closing around them. Captain Wei sat at a large wooden desk, his sharp eyes scanning a map of the city. He looked up as they entered, his expression unreadable. "You have proof, you say?" he asked, his voice measured. May stepped forward, pulling the ledger from beneath her cloak. "This has everything, names, dates, and the location of their hideout." Captain Wei's brows furrowed as he flipped through the pages. His lips tightened, and he glanced at the guards flanking the room. "This is significant," he admitted. "But how did you come by it?" "We followed them," May said. "The man running the operation has been stealing from the market and framing others, people like me." Wei's eyes narrowed. "People like you? You mean the performer accused of stealing a cash box?" May swallowed hard. "Yes, but I didn't do it. This ledger proves who's really responsible." Captain Wei studied her for a moment, his gaze piercing. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. I'll have my men investigate." Relief flooded May, but it was short-lived. As Wei issued orders, a commotion erupted outside. A messenger burst into the room, his face pale. "Sir, there's been an incident at the market. The thieves are attacking vendors." May's stomach dropped. They had been discovered. The market was chaos when they arrived. Stalls were overturned, goods scattered across the cobblestones. The orchestrator and his men were in full view, their desperation evident as they grabbed whatever they could and lashed out at anyone in their path. May and Jean stayed back as Captain Wei's guards charged forward, their swords clashing with the thieves' weapons. The orchestrator shouted orders, his voice cutting through the din. "Take everything! Leave nothing behind!" May's gaze locked on him, her anger surging. She couldn't let him escape. "Stay here," she told Jian, then darted into the fray. The crowd was a blur as May moved, her focus narrowing on the orchestrator. He spotted her and sneered, his expression turning smug. "You again," he said. "You don't know when to quit." "Neither do you," May shot back, her voice steady. She pulled out her juggling knives, their familiar weight grounding her. "Let's end this." The man lunged at her, his movements quick but sloppy. May sidestepped, using her agility to evade his strikes. Her knives flashed as she deflected his blows, her movements a dance of precision and control. The crowd around them seemed to fade, the noise a distant hum. Finally, May saw her opening. With a sharp twist, she knocked the man's weapon from his hand and pinned him against a fallen stall. "It's over," she said, her voice firm. The man laughed bitterly. "You think this will change anything? People like you will always be blamed." May's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she tied his hands with a length of rope from the stall and called out to Captain Wei. "Here's your orchestrator." Wei approached, his expression grim. "Good work," he said. "This will help restore order." As the guards rounded up the remaining thieves, May stepped back, her hands trembling slightly. Jian appeared beside her, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and admiration. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it," May corrected, a faint smile breaking through her exhaustion. The market was quieter than it had been in weeks, the chaos of the morning replaced by a tense stillness. Vendors tentatively returned to their stalls, picking up the pieces of their disrupted lives. Word spread quickly. The orchestrator and his men had been caught, their crimes laid bare in the ledger now in Captain Wei's possession. For the first time since the accusations against her began, May felt a glimmer of vindication, but the journey wasn't over. May and Jian stood before Captain Wei in the guardhouse. The ledger lay open on his desk, a tangible testament to the truth they had fought so hard to uncover. Wei's expression was unreadable as he looked between them. "You've done this city a great service," he said finally. "The evidence you provided not only clears your name, but exposes a network of thefts spanning years." May's breath caught. The relief she'd hoped for felt strangely hollow. "So, you'll tell the vendors I wasn't responsible?" Wei nodded. "I will. But understand this, May, trust is not easily repaired. Some will still believe what they want to believe." She swallowed hard, her hands curling into fists. "And what about the thieves? The orchestrator? They'll face justice," Wei said. "The courts will handle them. You've done enough." Enough. The word lingered in May's mind as she and Jian left the guardhouse. She should have felt triumphant, but the weight of the past weeks clung to her. Even as the truth emerged, the scars of suspicion remained. The next morning, May returned to the market. The air was crisp, the autumn chill biting at her skin. Jian trailed behind her, his steps hesitant. As they entered the square, conversations quieted, and all eyes turned toward them. May forced herself to meet their gazes, her head held high. A familiar vendor, the one who had first accused her, stepped forward. His face was flushed, whether with shame or anger, May couldn't tell. "I heard what the guard said," he began, his voice gruff. You weren't the thief." "No, I wasn't," May said evenly. She didn't look away, refusing to let his guilt or lingering doubt diminish her. The vendor shifted uncomfortably. I'm sorry for accusing you." May nodded, her expression softening slightly. "It's not just about me. This market, it's broken. We need to do better, to trust each other more." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment no one spoke. Then, a small child, one of those who had once laughed at her juggling, stepped forward and held out a coin. "Will you perform for us again?" the child asked, their voice hopeful. May hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing against her. Then she reached into her bag, pulling out her juggling balls. The child's smile widened, and soon a small crowd gathered. May began to juggle, her movements fluid and deliberate, each toss of the balls a silent declaration. She would not let this city's doubts define her. As the performance ended, the applause was hesitant but genuine. May collected her belongings and turned to Jian. "It's time," she said. "Time for what?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "To leave," May replied. "This city may never truly trust me again, but there are others out there who need a place to belong. People like us." Jian's eyes lit with understanding. "You mean a troupe?" May smiled, her first real smile in weeks. "Yes, a place where misjudged street performers can thrive, where we can tell our stories on our terms." Jian grinned. "I'm in." Later that evening, as the city's lanterns flickered to life, May and Jian packed their meager belongings. The market's distant hum carried through the streets, a reminder of what they were leaving behind and what lay ahead. May paused at the city gates, her gaze sweeping over the skyline one last time. "Do you think they'll remember us?" Jian asked, his voice quiet. May thought for a moment before answering. "Maybe, but it doesn't matter. What matters is what we do next." With that, they stepped into the night, the road stretching before them like a blank canvas. The future was uncertain, but May's heart was light. For the first time, she wasn't running away. She was moving forward. The road wound through open fields and small villages, each stop a stepping stone in May and Jian's journey toward something greater. With every passing mile, May felt the weight of the market's shadows begin to lift. She wasn't just leaving behind suspicion and mistrust. She was embracing a new chapter, one where she could shape her destiny rather than survive it. Their first performance as a pair took place in a small square surrounded by weathered buildings. May wore her bright costume once more, its bells jingling softly with every movement. Jian stood at the edge of the crowd, his slingshot in hand, not for mischief but for the tricks he had learned to perform with it. Together they drew smiles and laughter from the gathered villagers, their art a bridge between strangers. It was modest, but it was a start. Months passed, and May's dream of a troupe slowly took shape. They found others like them, street performers cast aside by society, each with a story to tell. There was Jian, a fire breather whose scarred hands spoke of a past accident he refused to explain. Lin, an acrobat whose graceful movements masked a quiet sadness, and Hana, a puppeteer whose wooden figures seemed almost alive under her skilled touch. They became a family, united not by blood but by resilience and the shared understanding of what it meant to be underestimated. Their performances grew more elaborate, their bond stronger with every act. Villages turned into towns, towns into cities, and their reputations spread. They called themselves the Lantern Troupe, a name symbolizing their mission, to bring light to the overlooked corners of the world. One evening, as they set up in a bustling town square, May noticed a familiar face in the crowd, the merchant from the market, the one who had first accused her. His expression was unreadable, but he didn't approach. Instead, he watched as the troupe performed, his eyes lingering on May as she juggled knives with precision and flair. When the performance ended, May walked over to him. The merchant hesitated before speaking. "You've come far," he said gruffly. May nodded. "We have." The merchant looked down, his face shadowed by regret. "I was wrong about you." It wasn't an apology, not in so many words, but May accepted it for what it was. "We all make mistakes," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "What matters is what we do after." The merchant nodded, then slipped away into the crowd. May watched him go, her heart surprisingly light. It wasn't forgiveness she had sought, it was closure. That night, the troupe gathered around a fire in a quiet field just outside the town. The stars above were bright, their light spilling across the dark canvas of the sky. Jian sat beside May, his face glowing in the firelight. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with quiet awe. "You turned everything around." May smiled, though her gaze remained fixed on the flame. "We did it," she corrected. "All of us." The troupe exchanged glances, their faces reflecting the shared pride of their journey. They had found not only an audience but a purpose, a way to reclaim their stories and share them with the world. As the fire crackled, May pulled out a small lantern and lit it, its warm glow joining the starlight above. She set it adrift into the night, watching as it floated higher and higher, a symbol of everything they had overcome and everything they had yet to achieve. "Here's to the next town," May said, raising her hand. The others joined her, their voices harmonizing in a quiet cheer. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they were ready for it. Together. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to HeroKind Stories and leave a comment to let us know your thoughts. Your words are important to motivate us.